I have a rule I live by now. If the air in a room feels heavy, I leave. I don't look for a rational explanation anymore. I don't check the pipes, and I don't look for a draft. I just get out. I learned that lesson the hard way about 3 years ago when I took a job as a night shift security guard for a massive, decommissioned textile mill on the outskirts of town. The pay was incredible, mostly because nobody stayed longer than a month. The mill was a sprawling complex of red brick and broken glass, surrounded by a chain-link fence that groaned in the wind. My job was simple. Walk the perimeter, check the heavy steel doors to ensure they were locked, and sit in a small booth with a bank of grainy monitors that covered the main floor. For the first week, it was the easiest money I'd ever made. I'd bring my laptop, work on some scripts, and drink coffee until the sun came up. The silence was absolute. But during the second week, the silence started to feel aggressive. It began with the monitors. Camera 4 looked over the old spinning room, a massive hall filled with rusted machinery that looked like skeletal remains in the dark. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., the motion sensor for that camera would trigger. I'd look up and the screen would just show the same rows of iron machines. No birds, no rats, no movement. Just the static of the night. I told myself it was a faulty sensor. Old buildings settle. Floorboards warp. But then I started finding things. I arrived for my shift 1, Tuesday, and noticed a small pile of rusted bolts sitting in the middle of the guard booth floor. They weren't there when I left. They were arranged in a perfect, tight circle. I swept them up, assuming the day guard was playing a prank on me. But when I asked him about it the next morning, he looked at me with a face so pale it made my stomach drop. He told me he hadn't stepped foot in the booth all day because he spent his shift patrolling the exterior. He was too creeped out to sit inside. That night, I decided to record my rounds. I'd been watching a lot of those urban explorer videos, and I thought it might be cool to document the decay of the mill for a personal project. I held my phone in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. I started in the basement. The smell down there was a mix of damp earth and something metallic. As I walked past the old boiler units, I was narrating into the phone, talking about the history of the mill and how quiet it was. I remember saying, "It feels like this place is holding its breath." I finished my round, locked the basement door, and spent the rest of the night in the booth. I didn't feel like I was being watched. I didn't hear any footsteps. It was a perfectly normal night at the mill. When I got home, I poured a glass of water and sat on my couch to watch the footage. I wanted to see if the camera captured the scale of the machinery. The video started with me walking down the basement stairs. The beam of my flashlight was cutting through the dark dot in the video. I'm talking about the boilers. I panned the camera to the left, showing a row of storage lockers. I didn't notice it while I was there, but on the screen, in the gap between the last two lockers, there was a hand. A pale, thin hand was gripping the edge of the metal. As I panned the camera past, the hand slowly withdrew into the darkness. I dropped my phone. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard it was painful. I played it back in slow motion. It wasn't a trick of the light. Someone was standing in the dark, inches away from me, watching me talk to myself. I should have quit then. I should have called my boss and told him to keep his money. But I was young, and I convinced myself it was a squatter, someone homeless, just looking for a place to sleep. I decided that for my next shift, I'd bring a can of pepper spray and be more assertive. That night, the air in the mill felt different. It was cold, not a winter cold, but a deep, hollow chill that seemed to come from the floorboards. I stayed in the booth with the door locked. I kept my eyes glued to the monitor's dot at 2 a.m. I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a crash or a bang. It was the sound of a metal chair being dragged across concrete. It was coming from the floor directly above me. Screescree dot. It was slow and rhythmic. I looked at the monitors. Camera 7 showed the break room upstairs. The room was empty, but a heavy iron chair was sitting in the middle of the floor. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. I grabbed my flashlight and the pepper spray. I told myself I was going to end this. I climbed the stairs, my boots echoing like gunshots in the stairwell. I reached the break room and threw the door open. The chair was in the center of the room, just like on the monitor. But it was still moving. It was vibrating slightly, as if someone had just let go of it. I scanned the room with my light. The windows were all boarded up. There were no back exits. "I know you're in here," I shouted. My voice sounded thin and weak. "The police are on their way. Just come out and leave." Silence. Then, from the corner of the room, behind a stack of old crates, I heard a wet, raspy breath. It sounded like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of pebbles. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the mill. I ran down the stairs, but when I reached the guard booth, I stopped dead. Every single monitor on the desk was black. But they weren't turned off. Someone had smeared something thick and dark over the camera lenses. And in the center of the desk, sitting right on top of my laptop, was that Miami Dolphins mug from the stories I'd heard, or at least a mug that looked exactly like it. It was filled with those same rusted bolts I'd swept up the night before. I realized then that this wasn't a squatter. A squatter wants to stay hidden. A squatter wants to be left alone. This person, this thing, wanted me to know it was there. It was playing with me. I turned to run for the main exit, but the heavy steel door, the one I had checked and double-checked, was jammed. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like someone was holding it shut from the other side. I began to panic. I started screaming for help, even though I knew the nearest house was a mile away. I ran back toward the spinning room, thinking I could break one of the high windows and climb out as I ran through the rows of machines. My flashlight began to flicker. I hit it against my palm, praying for the light to stay. In the brief flashes of light, I saw him. He was tall, freakishly tall, wearing a tattered gray jumpsuit that blended into the concrete. He wasn't running. He was walking toward me with a strange, jerky gait, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. His face was a blur of pale skin and dark hollows where his eyes should have been. I ducked behind a massive loom and held my breath. I could hear his boots on the floor. Clack, clack, clack. He was humming. It was a low, distorted version of a nursery rhyme. The wheels on the bus. I realized he wasn't looking for me. He knew where I was. He was just taking his time. I remembered my phone. I pulled it out, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I didn't call the police. I knew they wouldn't get there in time. I opened the camera app and turned on the flash. When the boots stopped on the other side of the loom, I stood up and started snapping photos, one after another. The bright flashes of light blinded him for a second. He let out a high-pitched, warbling shriek and covered his face. I used that second to sprint toward the loading dock at the back of the mill. I knew there was a small wicket door used for deliveries. I threw myself against it, and it burst open. I didn't stop running until I hit the chain-link fence. I climbed it so fast I didn't even feel the wire cutting into my hands. I reached my car, locked the doors, and drove until I found a gas station with bright lights and people. I sat there in the parking lot until the sun came up, staring at the dash. I never went back for my laptop. I didn't even call to quit. I just blocked the manager's number and moved to a different city a month later. A few weeks after I moved, I finally worked up the courage to look at the photos I took that night. Most of them were just blurs of gray and black, but the last one, the one I took right before I ran, showed him clearly. He wasn't covering his face because of the light. He was reaching out, and in the photo, you can see what he was holding. It wasn't a weapon. It was a small 3D printed toy train. A steam train with the face of a tiger. I don't know how he got it. I don't know why he had it. But it reminded me of a project I'd worked on months prior designs. I'd never shared with anyone outside of my personal files. That's when I realized the most horrifying part. He hadn't just been following me at the mill. He had been watching me at home. He had been looking through my windows, watching me work, learning what I liked, and waiting for the moment I'd be alone in the dark with him. I check my locks 5 times every night now. I have cameras on every corner of my house. But sometimes when it's very quiet and the wind hits the side of the building just right, I think I can hear a faint, raspy humming coming from the vents. And I never ever record myself in the dark anymore, because I'm afraid of what I might see standing behind me when I play the video back.